Right, we have with us Usman Chohan, who is an economist. Thank you so much for joining us. We've been talking about the issue, of course, of Afghanistan related to the OIC meeting. And of course, the economic crisis there. How do you see the situation? Of course, we know things are at a standstill as far as the issue of funds is concerned. We've seen some help come from Muslim countries. Pakistan also has given what we could. But overall, do you feel the situation is likely to improve from, of course, the reaction of the international community, also the attendance of it as far as the OIC is concerned?
Absolutely. And the reason I feel more confident is because the bar is very low.
Okay.
The bar is very low because right now, as your report has rightly stated, as other people are also giving us from news on the ground, we're in a state of almost universal poverty.
Okay.
In Afghanistan, and universal poverty is something very rarely seen in a society, especially when armed conflict is not there. So when you have universal poverty where 98% of people are about to go hungry in a tough winter with very few avenues of recourse and economic empowerment, then naturally one is inclined to think that things are only going to get better from so low a bar. Okay. That said, how soon and with how much suffering, that is to be determined by the initiative of the Afghans, as well as neighboring countries, particularly Pakistan's initiatives to help stabilize a neighbor and help to make it a decent regional environment where people can begin their lives anew after having spent so long, so many decades in uncertainty and overt and covert violence.
Okay. Usman, let me go to Mosharraf Zaidi. Also, we have with him, he's also with us, he's a senior analyst. Thank you for joining us. Mosharraf, we'll be talking about, of course, the humanitarian crisis, and Usman was just saying that, of course, it is the bar is very low because the things, as far as things are concerned, they're so bad that the only other option, of course, one hopes is that they will get better for the people there. But how do you see the situation as far as the international community is concerned? Do you think that there is a certain, we've seen a kind of disregard, we've seen the international community perhaps could have reacted in a more, could have empathized more with the situation in Afghanistan?
I think it still has a chance to do that, but I agree the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan deserves a lot more attention. And I think it's a really good step that the OIC is meeting in this extraordinary session that has been arranged. I think one has to applaud the leadership of the OIC, and particularly, as we all know, Saudi Arabia is a really vital country at the OIC, so it's really good that they've decided to support this. I think it's great that Pakistan continues to advocate for Afghans. But ultimately, the most important decision that's going to be made about Afghanistan's humanitarian crisis and its economy is going to be made by the US. And I think the Americans have a chance to demonstrate grace in defeat, so to speak. I think there's a great op-ed today by David Ignatius in the Washington Post in which he makes exactly that point. He says that the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan is not the fault of the Afghan people. And they should not be punished for mistakes made by others, both Afghan leaders from the Taliban, from the Haqqani network, but especially Afghan leaders from the Ghani era and the Karzai era. Those mistakes, and of course America's own miscalculations and errors of judgment, but all of those should not become a reason to persecute and enforce this kind of suffering on the Afghan people.
Right, Mosharraf, let me come back to you. Please stay with us. Usman, you heard what Mosharraf was saying. He's talking about the fact that, of course, the ultimate sufferers of all of this are the Afghan people. And we've seen the situation go worse and worse, like you yourself also mentioned. But overall, as far as the West is concerned, what about the Afghan leaders themselves? I've also been having this discussion with Azaz Chaudhry Sahab, who's a former ambassador, earlier on, about how the old Taliban and the new Taliban, and of course the expectations of the fact that they would walk the talk when they said that things would be different as far as these Taliban are concerned. The more enlightened version, so to speak, as far as education of women and children are concerned, as far as, granting those working rights, women the right to work, all of those things. Why don't we see, why is there such a reluctance from the Taliban to go there, so to speak?
This is an excellent question because you don't get a clear answer looking at the Taliban as a monolith. Actually, there is a factional competing interest, as there would be in any organization, especially a victorious organization, where there are stalwarts who say that since we have won, we will dictate the terms of our victory. But at the same time, previously the word was used liberal. I wouldn't categorize any Taliban as liberal. I would simply say that there's some more progressive wings within it. That tends to be the younger folk in there who don't have the burden of the 90s and didn't necessarily witness what was back then. So there are vying competing interests within what is not a because Taliban's success is premised on the fact that it wasn't a monolith, that it was a decentralized organization that was essentially an indigenous movement. And so those competing voices are going to be shaped by the exogenous force being the poverty, the famine, the inflation, the drought, COVID-19, which is not even something you see, you just feel that people are dying around you. And these exogenous forces combined then lead to greater antagonisms in what would otherwise be a united interest. The united interest being seeing Afghanistan bounce back. But who bounces back within what is essentially a pluralist polity? It is not really a nation, in my judgment, to the extent that there are vying ethnic interests that also have their own viewpoints, and somebody who could coalesce all of these sub-nations, you can say, to make a true Afghan nation once again. That requires a lot of hard work and a lot of compromise, which doesn't come immediately.
You've talked about united interest. I want to go to Mosharraf Zaidi with this. I'll come back to you. Mosharraf, Usman mentioned a united interest. Do you think that, in a world where, of course, all nations have their own interess, dictated by their own economics, dictated by their own strategic interests, their own regional interests, all of those things. Do you think that there is, other than, of course, now that we're seeing this OIC meeting also, the Islamic community rally forth so forward as far as the cause of Afghanistan is concerned. But do you think there is a united interest in Afghanistan prospering after the way the Americans left the way they did? Can you hear me? I think there's a problem with audio. You need to unmute yourself.
I'm so sorry. I wanted to avoid interfering
that's fine.
with white noise. I think there is absolutely a very strong case to be made that peace and prosperity in Afghanistan is to the benefit of Afghanistan, but also to the benefit of its immediate neighbors. Its immediate neighbors are a group of 6 that have been working together really since before August 15th, but especially after August 15th. And those 6 countries include Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Pakistan, China, and Iran. And I think that these countries have demonstrated, despite having divergent interests in many cases, they've demonstrated their capability of coming together and discussing these issues. I think that the Troika Plus formulation with China, Russia, the United States, and Pakistan coming together despite all the differences between the US and China, I think that also proves that there are mutual interests that are served and that these countries are conscious of those interests and want to pursue them. But I do think that there's been a generic failure to understand and appreciate the realities that shape life for the ordinary Afghan and the incentive structure that influences and shapes Taliban decision-making and Taliban behavior. So as long as we keep getting our analysis about Afghanistan wrong, all the willingness to work together in the world will not produce the required results. And the required results are a halfway meeting point between what the world wants the Taliban to do and what the Taliban are able to do given the constraints that they operate under.
Do you think that one of those, we talk about constraints, we also talk about the fact that, of course, the 2 different versions, so to speak, of the Taliban's. It's about the fact that there are disagreements within their ranks, and like Usman mentioned, he's saying that there is the ones that are influenced by the old thought and the younger ones, but most of them are quite young, isn't it true?
As you know, of course, Afghanistan, Pakistan, this whole region, we are vastly young populations,
Right,
and so of
right.
course
I mean, of the
that's
90s, so to speak, the Taliban of the 90s, and that the fact that they were, their thinking, of course, was more conservative, and it's hoped, and all over the international community that these Taliban will be different.
So I think that the expectation that the Taliban would be very different, that they would certainly have enlightened, progressive views about women or human rights. I mean, I think that especially when Pakistanis make those assumptions, maybe it's helpful to just take a closer look even here at home. Or frankly, to take a look at Brexit, or to take a look at Donald Trump's rise to prominence, or to take a look at Marine Le Pen. I think that this idea somehow that the Taliban should be the standard bearers for progressive or openness or values related to or associated with freedom and liberty, I don't think it was ever realistic. And they may be very young, and the vast majority of the fighting forces within the Taliban are young people. But the Taliban is an ideological movement. It's not it's a manifestation that has political realities associated with it, but the Taliban are rooted and anchored in a certain worldview. And so no matter how enlightened and moderate they seemed in Doha, they weren't going to transform into Bernie Sanders or any kind of sort of centrist or left-leaning fantasy that I think many people.
But don't you think that it was a valid expectation that they would perhaps honor? Let me come back to you. I'm going to go to Usman. I will come back to you. Ji, Usman, don't you think that overall the expectation that they would honor their promises as far as women and children were concerned was perhaps not that misguided?
Yes, I mean, one would think that they would learn from what is required to build a new society in pragmatic terms. Yes, they're ideological, but they have views on the ground. The question is, are they a revolutionary movement or are they a reactionary movement? And this is where I think people gauge it wrong. So revolutionaries would say that there's something glorious at the end, so let's work towards it. But and the reactionary says that there's a rupture in the past and we have to go and correct the past. So they're backward looking. And so I think that people mischaracterize it as being either too forward looking or too backward looking. And the practicalities that are being put on them right now is that they cannot look anywhere but immediately in front of them. Now, what does that mean?
So it would be practical for them then to realize that if they want the world to give them the money that they need, they will have to walk the talk.
You're absolutely right. That's absolutely right. And now I think that from what I gauge, looking at the West, is that it's really boiled down to a couple of issues. And at the top of that list is, are you going to protect women's rights? And the reason that this is important, pragmatically speaking, is that women are half of society. And when they're educated and empowered, it is the biggest driver for economic development. So even in Pakistan, it should be our foremost priority and we should be the vanguard among the community of nations saying that women empowerment is important, because it's going to be the biggest driver of our development too. Because if you look at the stats here, one big gap you see is that. But for Afghanistan, the point is, can they come around to this? Can they address this one issue? The reason that this is so important as well is that there is a lot of lobbying. There are strong feminist movements or liberal movements in the West that have anchored themselves in the point that this oppression is unacceptable, and they're fundamentally right about that. So if this one talking point can be cleared, that would already be a huge deal in the negotiations.
Right, and you would, see perhaps the Americans relenting if they saw that, right?
Agreed.
Mosharraf, you've been hearing what Usman has to say. What are your comments on this? Of course, this is a huge point as far as women development, as far as the West is concerned. Of course, there has been some concern about the fact that there are double standards as far as the West is also concerned, and particularly with regard to Afghanistan and other areas and other countries. But of course, if we saw the Afghans relenting on the issue of women going to school, children going to school, and women rights generally, we would perhaps see a reaction.
Unfortunately, I think that the calculus of the Western powers, and particularly the United States, but frankly also countries like Russia, China, and I would go so far as to include Pakistan in that list. The principal interest that these countries have in the situation in Afghanistan is not, unfortunately, the condition of the Afghan people. Their principal interest in Afghanistan is the future of counterterrorism capability within the Afghan state and the use of Afghan soil by groups that seek to damage and destroy their competitors or their enemies, so-called enemies, using the freedom that they enjoy or the safe havens they enjoy in Afghanistan. So I think if we want to see a major change in global and especially US behavior towards Afghanistan, I think what they're looking for above all things is effective counterterrorism. And I think that women's rights are a very distant second or third, priority for all the countries involved. And I think, of course, that's very unfortunate. But that's the way that, that's the basis of the entire engagement with Afghanistan. And they never went in there to save the women of Afghanistan, and they're not going to suddenly change the listings of Afghan individuals or groups because girls are suddenly allowed to go to school or
so what do you think will change things significantly for the Afghani people in terms of the funds, unfreezing that we're talking about?
Look, this is really complicated, but there's a simple way to understand it.
Gee.
One of the most important elements of the Taliban, and I would say the most powerful element within the Taliban today, is the Haqqani network. And they carry 4 ministries, including a couple of the really important ones. And as you know, the Haqqani network is listed by the UN Security Council 1267 Resolutions Committee. So barring a delisting of the Haqqani network, among many other individuals and groups in Afghanistan, it's hard to imagine that an Afghan government or state that is run by people who are on the 1267 sanctions list would be able to access what are the sovereign and fully owned funds of the Afghan people. Given that being the case, and given that we don't see any alternative to the Taliban, what we're going to have to come up with are shortcuts and solutions that bypass the Afghan government. Now, this is, of course, not only is it not ideal, but it's actually badly damaging for the sovereignty of Afghanistan, for the idea of a future Afghan state, for the functionality and the services that we all believe, I'm sure we all believe the Afghan people, especially its women and its children, deserve. For all of those reasons, it would be much better if there was a delisting and the sanctions were just lifted. But I don't see a realistic set of scenarios in which those sanctions will be lifted, because I don't see the Haqqani network being one that will be.
What do you think what do you think as far as this OIC meeting is concerned? Do you think, realistically speaking, we will have some concrete measures emerging from this meeting? Because Pakistan is certainly hopeful that that will happen. We've also had the foreign minister say that he sees that there is a certain change all over.
Well, I certainly think that the OIC meeting is important, because these OIC countries will have a chance to explicitly commit funds for the humanitarian mission in Afghanistan throughout this winter. So I think in terms of amassing those funds and identifying pathways of spending those funds, and I think largely it'll be the UN agencies and some of the large non-profits or charity organizations. From that perspective, I think we will make great progress. I think it's also important for OIC countries to demonstrate an ownership of Afghanistan, much in the way that so many other multilateral formations have since August 15th. But I don't see that the OIC will be able to manufacture a resolution to the issue of the sanctions. That really is a US government decision that will drive the solution on that front.
Right, okay, let me come back to you. Usman Sahab, do you agree? You think that as far as the US is concerned, unfortunately, you think that Mosharraf Sahab is right? He's saying that, he doesn't see that is a decision that the US will take, of course, and the interest as far as within Afghanistan is, of course, different than what is said, as far as women's rights and children are concerned.
Yes, the question should really be framed by us in Pakistan in terms of crisis management and sustainable growth. For crisis management, what is being done, this initiative that is being led by the OIC, where Pakistan has always played an important role, is very good. I studied deeply crisis situations, and there are many ways to structure this. For example, you could have after the Gulf War, they had for the Oil for Food program for Iraq an account in escrow that was managed by a private bank, BNP Paribas, and that was very unfair to the Iraqi people. But at least the crisis management element post-war was done. That could be done here too. You can have escrow accounts. There's trust funds and other ways to structure this. That's fine. But sustainable growth is what I really care about, because our young population in Afghanistan and even in Pakistan is growing up at such a fragile age with this trauma. They begin lives seeing it in this difficult circumstance. That is what I'm worried about, because what sort of baggage are they going to grow up with? Well, you already had the equivalent of millennials who are 40 or less have grown up with non-stop violence. When are we going to have the seeds, the green shoots of prosperity in our region? And for that, even the 9 billion that we talk about is just $225 per capita. That I can spend $225 in an hour. You know, that it's just not that enough. So I want to see the structures of their economy as interlinked with their neighbors, including us, made sustainable.
Right. Okay. Let me. Unfortunately, we have to. We're running out of time. Mosharraf, your comments on this sustainable growth that Usman is talking about, the fact that linked with, the way he put it. How do you see it? How long do you think will it take, realistically also? Because it has its own effects for Pakistan also.
Of course. I think that Usman is absolutely right. That should be a priority, especially for Pakistan. But I would also say that is a priority for Pakistan. Over the last couple of years in particular, there's been a growing elite consensus in Pakistan that the geostrategic and geopolitical pursuits that Pakistan has really been forced to make over the last 4 decades have not produced the strategic outcomes that are aligned with a strong, stable, and secure and prosperous Pakistani nation. And so this shift towards geoeconomics is perfectly aligned with the idea of individual microeconomic opportunity for the people of Afghanistan, the people of Pakistan. And I think increasingly importantly, when we have these conversations in Pakistan, there are 2 countries that we must mention every time, and those are Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. What we're seeing over the last year in particular is the Pakistani state, for all its foibles and mistakes in other arenas, including domestically, but there's been a great clarity about this geo-economic future, and there's been a lot of diplomatic effort that's gone into it. I think the next steps for that are to revisit the nature of the Pakistani state's capability and its structure, and whether or not what we have today can service the kind of future that Usman's talking about. My very short answer to that question is it absolutely is not, and therefore we need a structured, organized, and very coherent dismantling of the existing systems of governance in the country, and a rebuilding of state capacity to be able to deliver that kind of not just domestic but regional prosperity surge that I think could carry a population of 400 million Pakistanis by the middle of this century into a future that's much better than the past that we've had.
Right. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for joining us. Usman, your last comment as far as this regional prosperity that we talk about. Of course, it's interlinked with all our regional partners, and the way that the OIC is now coming together. Of course, that will be one of the things on the agenda for Pakistan particularly.
Yes, my final comment would be that Pakistan has done and continues to do an excellent job in terms of signaling that it is now a sober society. In the India-Pakistan standoff of 2019, we managed it with sobriety. The COVID crisis, we used a scientific basis to manage it with sobriety. And now in this 2021 fall of Kabul and post-war Afghanistan, we're engaging with sobriety, asking everyone else to come together so that we can deal in a sober manner with the humanitarian issue. And this sobriety, if we continue it crisis after crisis, we don't pick these battles, they are imposed on us. We are doing a good job. It is a lot of work mentally and psychologically, but that's why Pakistan is known as a resilient nation, because this is how we have to go about the 21st century.
Right. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for joining us and your comments about resilience. Of course, we are a resilient nation, and we hope that, our resilience will be tested less and less. We'll go back to our, as far as our coverage of the OIC meeting is concerned after the news. Thank you so much for being with us.